Welcome to Update, Sunday, May 4th, 2025. This is The Deep Dive.
Hello.
So today we're jumping right into a quick update on something that's been catching our eye recently, the Russian economy.
hmm
We've been seeing these reports, suggesting that since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, their economy's actually shown some, well, unexpected growth.
Yeah, it's surprising on the surface, even outperforming places like the US and Europe in the last year, according to some figures.
Okay, exactly. So let's try and unpack what that really means.
It's definitely a narrative you hear quite a bit. Vladimir Putin supporters, they point to this growth and say, see, Western sanctions failed.
Right. But there's a really crucial point we need to keep in mind here.
Which is...
Ukraine's economy. It's also shown significant growth during the same period.
Okay. That's important context.
It really is. So I think the key thing right off the bat is that, well, economic data during wartime, you have to look at it really critically, don't you?
Absolutely. You can't just take those headline numbers at face value.
So our mission today is basically to look beyond those initial growth figures. What does this reported growth actually signify when you consider it's, a wartime economy? It's definitely not business as usual over there.
Not at all. Wartime economies, they just operate under fundamentally different rules, different dynamics.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, conflict leads to destruction, infrastructure damage, loss of human capital, things that don't always show up immediately in the economic stats.
Right.
But the sheer amount of spending on war stuff, that has a huge impact on GDP figures.
Okay, so let's take an example. If Russia spends, say, $1 billion making tanks.
That $1 billion, bang, it's immediately counted in their gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced.
Got it.
But, and this is a crucial early insight that doesn't automatically mean it creates lasting economic value or benefit.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. What happens when those tanks, as reports suggest, are destroyed pretty quickly over in Ukraine?
Precisely.
Right.
That initial $1 billion spend, it still counts towards the GDP figure for that year.
Even though the asset itself is gone.
Even though it's gone, it hasn't generated any sustainable value for the Russian economy in the long run. So a key takeaway right here is that wartime GDP growth can be, well, kind of an illusion if it's just based on stuff that gets used up or destroyed really fast.
Illusory feels like the right word. One source we looked at even compared it to basically just printing money and handing it over to arms manufacturers and maybe their shareholders without any real increase in useful output for the rest of the economy.
Yeah, it's not creating broader prosperity. And what's fascinating is where this growth is actually coming from. Our sources are pretty clear on this. Essentially, all of Russia's reported economic growth since the invasion, you can trace it back to the military sector.
All of it. Wow.
Pretty much. Defense spending has shot up dramatically. It went from maybe 3% of Russia's GDP before the war
Okay.
to nearly 7% now. That's a massive shift in where the country's resources are going.
That is a huge reallocation. And it's not just the cost of the tanks and the missiles themselves, is it? The economic burden of war goes way beyond just procurement.
Oh, absolutely. Beyond buying weapons, you've got huge increases in healthcare costs for wounded soldiers, the expense of repairing damaged infrastructure, maybe not inside Russia as much, but related costs and all sorts of other war-related spending that just wouldn't exist in peacetime.
And these things contribute to GDP too.
They do, but they might not fall under that narrow military spending category we just talked about.
Okay. And then there's the whole massive job of completely redirecting their trade.
Exactly. The sanctions forced this pivot, right?
Yeah.
Away from Europe and the US towards places like China and India.
Yeah.
And that switch has come at a really significant cost. You're talking about building completely new transport routes, new pipelines, new logistics, setting up entirely new supply chains.
Stuff they wouldn't have needed otherwise.
Completely unnecessary spending under normal circumstances. So it adds to GDP, sure, because it's activity, it's investment.
But it's forced investment.
Right. It's spending driven by necessity due to the conflict, not necessarily by sound economic strategy for long-term growth. So another key insight. This kind of forced economic restructuring can inflate GDP figures without actually indicating underlying economic strength.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. We're seeing GDP growth driven by spending on things that are either, quickly destroyed
That's like the tanks.
or related to this massive, expensive, forced restructuring of trade. That doesn't really sound like the foundation for a healthy, sustainable economy.
It really doesn't. In fact, Russia's own central bank points to government spending as the main engine of their GDP growth right now.
Oh, interesting. They admit it themselves.
Pretty much. The share of the total government budget going to war-related stuff, it's ballooned from maybe 23% before the invasion
Okay.
to nearly 40% recently.
40%. Wow. And all this extra money sloshing around in the economy without a matching increase in, like, valuable goods and services people actually want or need.
Yeah.
That kind of points us towards a classic economic problem, doesn't it?
It absolutely does inflation. And Russia has been really grappling with a significant surge in prices.
Yeah, I saw reports on that.
While inflation has been cooling off in many other parts of the world, in Russia, consumer prices were up over 10% year on year back in March.
Over 10%.
Yeah. We even saw these anecdotes, these reports of basic things like butter being stolen from shops because prices were rising so fast.
And it's hitting essentials, right? Like fruit and vegetables up over 20%, potato costs nearly doubling. These are things that hit ordinary people really hard every day.
Absolutely. Very real impacts.
So what's driving this? Why is inflation staying so high there when it's coming down elsewhere?
It's a few connected things, really. Western sanctions, for one, plus the weaker ruble. That makes imported goods way more expensive and just harder to get hold of.
Okay, makes sense.
And then there's the labor market, conscripting hundreds of thousands of men for the military, plus others emigrating to avoid the draft or, for political reasons.
Right, that takes a big chunk out of the workforce.
A huge chunk. So you've got significant labor shortages in the civilian economy.
Fewer workers available for regular jobs.
Exactly. And this shortage, combined with the fact that the military-industrial complex is paying high wages to attract workers.
They have to compete.
Right. It drives up wages across the board. Civilian businesses have to pay more just to find and keep staff. And when their labor costs go up,
They pass it on to consumers through higher prices.
precisely. So you might see these official unemployment figures looking really low, but they can actually hide some serious underlying problems in the labor market.
So yeah, unemployment's apparently at a record low, something like 2%. But you're saying that's not necessarily a good sign.
Not necessarily, no. It's more likely a symptom of a severe shortage of workers, especially in those non-military parts of the economy.
That's a really crucial distinction to make. The low number looks good, but it masks these big imbalances.
Mm-hmm. And the government has also massively boosted pay for volunteer soldiers, we're talking, like reports of up to 5 times the average Russian income.
Wow, 5 times.
Yeah. So naturally, that pulls a lot of labor away from regular civilian jobs. Who wouldn't take that pay bump if offered?
Okay, and the government's also been trying to stimulate the economy in other ways too, right? Even while the central bank is trying to slam the brakes on inflation with super high interest rates.
Yes, exactly. It's a bit of a contradictory policy mix, actually. You've got the central bank keeping interest rates incredibly high. What is it now, 21%?
21%, that's huge.
It is. But at the same time, the government is pushing out significant fiscal stimulus, especially through things like subsidized mortgages, cheap loans for housing.
Okay. So they're encouraging borrowing and building in that specific sector, even though borrowing costs are sky high everywhere else.
Pretty much. It creates this strong incentive to borrow and build houses, despite the wider economic conditions and the central bank's efforts.
So you've got the central bank pulling one way, trying to cool things down, and the government pushing the other way, actively encouraging spending in certain areas. That sounds like a recipe for a really unbalanced economy.
Unbalanced. It's a good word for it. Precisely. This combination, massive military spending, this targeted government stimulus, plus the tight labor market, it creates an economic picture that looks kind of robust if you just glance at the surface GDP.
But underneath,
It's likely really unsustainable in the long run. It kind of brings to mind that classic economic trade-off, guns versus butter.
yeah. And right now, it definitely seems like guns are getting the priority.
Clearly.
Okay, what about the general health of Russian businesses, the ones outside the defense sector?
Well, the picture there looks quite a bit less encouraging. Despite all this activity in certain areas, corporate bankruptcies actually jumped significantly last year by 20%.
20% increase in bankruptcies. Ouch.
And corporate debt has also gone up considerably. Plus, there are these reports suggesting the government has been, let's say, leaning on state-controlled banks to give loans to certain favored businesses, maybe defense-related, maybe others, at interest rates below the market rate.
Okay, so cheap loans for friends of the state, basically. That sounds, well, A bit concerning for long-term stability, doesn't it?
It definitely raises concerns. You worry about hidden risks building up in the financial system. Are these loans actually viable? Will they be repaid?
Or will the government have to bail them out later?
Exactly. It raises questions about potentially hidden budget deficits, too. If these loans go bad, the cost eventually lands back on the state. Some analysts have even called this a kind of massive money printing that just isn't showing up directly on the government's books right now.
Sneaky. And what about factors outside Russia? External economic pressures starting to bite.
Yes, definitely. The recent drop in global oil prices is a big one.
Right. Crucial for their budget,
Crucial. And combine that with a bit of an economic slowdown in China,
which is now their main customer, basically.
their primary export market, yeah. So that's a double whammy. Oil and gas revenues, which the Russian state relies on heavily, they've fallen.
So the money funding the war effort,
Mm-hmm.
that's facing pressure.
Correct. As a result, the government has actually had to increase its forecast for the budget deficit and lower its expectations for energy revenues going forward.
So how are they managing to keep funding everything then, if energy money is down?
Well, they've been dipping into their sovereign wealth fund, the National Wealth Fund.
Okay, the rainy day fund.
Kind of. They've also been letting real wages, what wages can actually buy, decline in some public sectors. And they've brought in tax hikes and made cuts to non-military spending to free up cash for the war.
Tightening the belt elsewhere. And we shouldn't forget about those frozen assets either, right?
Absolutely crucial point. Roughly half of Russia's foreign currency and gold reserves are still frozen by Western countries due to sanctions.
Half. That's huge.
It definitely limits their financial flexibility, their ability to handle economic shocks or prop up the ruble.
You know, all of this kind of brings to mind that concept. One of the sources mentioned Dutch disease. Could you unpack that a bit and why it's relevant here?
Sure. Dutch disease, it's an economic idea, right? It describes what can happen when a country gets suddenly rich from one natural resource, like oil or gas, like the Netherlands did with natural gas, hence the name.
Okay.
That flood of income from the one sector can push up the value of the country's currency.
Which sounds good, but
But it makes everything else the country produces, like manufactured goods, more expensive for foreigners to buy, so other sectors become less competitive internationally.
I see. So the resource boom kind of smothers other parts of the economy.
Exactly. And historically, you could argue Russia's heavy reliance on oil and gas exports might have done something similar, maybe inadvertently holding back the development of other industries, hindering overall productivity.
And how does that connect to the war economy?
Well, the argument is that this existing structure, already heavily reliant on resources and energy-intensive industries, might have made the transition to a war economy somewhat easier.
Easier. How so?
Because those types of industries, perhaps, could be more readily redirected towards military needs, metals, energy, heavy manufacturing. But the flip side is the long-term impact. It further entrenches that reliance and doesn't help with diversifying the economy down the road.
Right. And those long-term implications, especially for a potential post-war economy.
Yeah, they look pretty considerable. Trying to get back to a more normal economic footing after this conflict, that's going to be a massive challenge.
Especially with the lack of foreign investment now.
Exactly. Lack of investment, lack of access to Western technology, lack of real competition. It all likely contributes to a kind of slow decay, a gradual decline in the quality and efficiency of Russian businesses outside that protected military sphere.
And unlike a lot of post-conflict situations, we're probably not going to see a huge reconstruction boom inside Russia itself, are we?
That seems unlikely, yeah. The actual physical damage to infrastructure within Russia has been relatively limited compared to, say, Ukraine. So that typical large-scale rebuilding phase you often see after wars, it probably won't be as significant a driver of growth there.
Is there any historical parallel, maybe?
Well, some point to the economic disruption Russia faced after the Cold War ended. That sudden demilitarization, scaling back the huge Soviet military-industrial complex that caused a massive economic shock. It serves as a kind of reminder of the potential pain when large military spending programs eventually get wound down.
And thinking about winding down, what about the financial side? All those cheap preferential loans you mentioned earlier.
That's another major risk looming for a post-war scenario. There's a real concern about a potential wave of defaults.
Because the businesses that got those loans might not be viable without government support or wartime contracts.
Precisely. The sheer volume of these below-market rate loans handed out to defense firms and other favored industries could lead to a serious financial hangover down the line.
Okay, so Despite those surprising headline growth numbers we started with, the actual underlying health of the Russian economy
Yeah.
seems, well, fragile, might be putting it mildly.
Fragile, unbalanced, heavily distorted by wartime priorities.
Yeah.
While organizations like the IMF might still project some modest growth for the next few years,
Hmm.
the broader economic outlook is just incredibly uncertain, especially with sanctions likely staying in place and all these internal and external pressures we've discussed.
Okay, so let's try and quickly recap the main points from this deep dive. The reported growth we're seeing in Russia, it seems really heavily driven by wartime spending, right? Especially the military sector, which is now a much, much bigger slice of their GDP.
Right, from about 3% to almost 7%.
And while that spending does boost the GDP number, it doesn't necessarily mean real economic value or, benefit for the average Russian.
Exactly. Think of the tanks analogy: counted, then destroyed.
Then there are the big costs of having to totally reorient their trade away from the West towards China and India. That government spending is basically the main driver, according to their own central bank.
And that's fueling stubborn high inflation over 10% hitting basics like food.
Yeah, and that low unemployment figure, around 2%, it sounds good. But it's actually masking big labor shortages in civilian jobs, partly because military pay is so high now.
Right, pulling workers away. And we saw that clash between the central bank trying to cool things with high rates, 21%, while the government pushes stimulus like cheap mortgages.
Creating that unbalanced economy. We also noted corporate bankruptcies and debt are up, and there are worries about hidden risks from those cheap loans to favored companies.
Potentially hiding a bigger budget deficit. Plus, falling oil prices and China's slowdown are creating new headwinds for their main income source.
And they're funding the war by dipping into their wealth fund, letting some real wages fall, raising taxes, cutting non-military spending, all while half their reserves are frozen.
Don't forget the Dutch disease context, either how their resource dependency might have made the shift to war easier, but makes getting back to normal harder.
Right. And that lack of foreign investment, tech, competition is likely causing a slow rot in non-military businesses. No big reconstruction boom expected inside Russia itself.
And the post-Cold War demilitarization shock is a warning sign, plus the risk of loan defaults post-war. So yeah, modest growth projected, but sanctions aren't going away soon.
It paints a very different picture than just looking at the headline GDP growth.
A much more complex and arguably worrying picture.
Okay, so here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, does that reported growth in the Russian economy look more like a sign of genuine strength? Or is it really just a symptom of an economy on a fundamentally unbalanced, maybe unsustainable wartime footing?
And following on from that, what do you think the longer-term consequences might be? For Russia itself, obviously, but also for the rest of the global economy. Yeah.
Definitely something to think about. We encourage you to maybe dig a bit deeper into some of those indicators we touched on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.